A widow with nothing left to lose stands on an auction block not for sale, but desperate enough to accept any offer, even a pair of worn boots, until the town's most mysterious rancher makes a bid that silences every laugh and changes two broken lives forever. The auctioneer's hammer came down hard enough to split wood, but Martha Crenshaw barely flinched. She'd been standing on that makeshift platform for 20 minutes now, watching faces in the crowd shift from curious to uncomfortable to downright cruel, as Sela's Hodge rattled off her late husband's debts like he was reading scripture. $437. Might as well have been 4,000. The farm was gone, the livestock sold. Even Thomas's wedding ring had disappeared into someone's pocket 3 days ago. "Now, folks, we got ourselves a situation here," Hodge called out, his voice carrying that oily satisfaction men got when they held all the cards. "Mrs. Crenshaw here owes more than she can pay, and according to territorial law, that makes her indentured until the debt's settled." He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "Who'll take responsibility for this woman's obligations?" Martha kept her chin up even as her stomach twisted. She'd known this moment would come ever since the fever took Thomas last spring, leaving her with nothing but a failed crop and a mountain of promises he'd made to keep them afloat. The townspeople shifted and murmured, some looking away in shame, others leaning forward with the kind of interest that made her skin crawl. "I'll give you a pair of boots for her," called out Pete Whitman from the back of the crowd, and the laughter that followed hit Martha like a physical blow. She taught Pete's children their letters not 2 years ago, had brought soup to his wife when she'd been laid up with childbirth. Now he was grinning like he'd made the joke of the century. "Boots it is, then," Hodge chuckled, raising his hammer. "Going once for a pair of $500. The voice cut through the laughter like a blade, quiet, but carrying enough weight to silence every mouth in the square. Martha's eyes snapped to the source and found Jacob Reeves standing at the edge of the crowd, hat pulled low over his face but not low enough to hide the steel in his dark eyes. The Silent Ridge Rancher, they called him, though most people just called him Strange. He'd been living alone in the hills for near on 7 years, coming to town only when he absolutely had to, speaking to no one except the store clerk, and even then only in single words. Hodge's hammer froze mid-swing. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "500, Jacob repeated, stepping forward through the crowd that parted before him like he was carrying plague. "Cash money." Martha felt her legs go weak. $500 would not only clear Thomas's debts, but leave her with enough to start over somewhere else, maybe back east where nobody knew about the auction block or the boots, or the way her neighbors had watched her humiliation like it was Sunday entertainment. But Jacob Reeves was a mystery wrapped in rumors, a man who'd appeared in Millfield with enough gold to buy the biggest spread in the county, and enough silence to make people wonder what he was running from. "Well now," Hodge sputtered, clearly thrown off his rhythm. "That's a mighty generous offer, Mr. Reeves, but you understand this is an indenture situation. The woman would be bound to work off the debt, legally speaking." Jacob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand the law." The crowd had gone dead quiet now, watching this unexpected turn like vultures eyeing fresh carrion. Martha could feel their stares boring into her back, could practically hear the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her days if she stayed in this town. The mysterious rancher and the desperate widow, it would keep tongues wagging through the next 3 winters. But what choice did she have? Pete Whitman was still holding up his worn boots with a grin that made her want to scratch his eyes out, and there were other men in the crowd with looks that suggested their offers might be even worse. At least Jacob Reeves had never given her reason to fear him, even if he'd never given her reason to trust him either. 500 once, Hodge called, though his voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. 500 twice. He looked around the crowd hopefully, as if someone might suddenly outbid the strange rancher and restore the natural order of things. No one spoke. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared down at Jacob, trying to read something, anything, in those shadowed features. What did he want with her? What did any man want with a woman bound to him by law and debt? The hammer fell with a sound like thunder. Sold to Jacob Reeves for $500. Martha's knees buckled, but she caught herself before she could fall. Around her, the crowd began to disperse, some disappointed at the lack of continued spectacle, others clearly planning to spread the news of this strange transaction to anyone who'd listen. Jacob pushed through them, ignoring the whispers and stares, and climbed the platform steps with the measured pace of a man walking to his own execution. Up close, Martha could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his hands hung loose at his sides like he was ready for trouble even at a debt auction. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered look that came from years of hard work and harder choices. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat, "I'll have my wagon brought around." "Mr. Reeves," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. Everyone deserves a second chance. Before she could ask what he meant, he'd stepped back down and was walking toward the general store, leaving her standing alone on the platform with $500 worth of questions, and the growing certainty that her life had just taken a turn into territory even stranger than the auction block. Silas Hodge appeared at her elbow with a satisfied smile and a leather pouch that clinked when he set it in her hands. "Congratulations, Mrs. Crenshaw, you're a free woman." His smile widened into something ugly. "Well, free to serve out your indenture to the Silent Ridge rancher. Hope you're good with cattle." Martha closed her fingers around the pouch and felt the weight of her new reality settle over her shoulders like a yoke. Free woman. The words would have been funny if they weren't so desperately sad. She'd gone from being Thomas's wife to being Jacob Reeves' indentured servant, and she still didn't know which fate was worse. But as she watched Jacob's tall figure disappear into the general store, she found herself thinking about second chances and wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the Silent Ridge rancher than the town gossips knew. The wagon ride to Silent Ridge stretched longer than Martha had expected, winding through hills that seemed to fold in on themselves, until the town disappeared completely behind walls of red rock and scrub pine. Jacob drove in absolute silence, his hands steady on the reins, eyes fixed on the trail ahead like he was navigating by memory alone. Martha sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, her single carpetbag clutched in her lap, trying not to think about how this was the farthest she'd been from Millfield since her wedding day 8 years ago. The sun was starting its descent toward the western peaks when they finally crested a ridge, and Martha got her first look at what $500 had bought. The ranch spread out below them like something from a fever dream, not the rough, patched-together homestead she'd expected, but a collection of solid buildings arranged around a main house that looked like it belonged to someone with serious money. The barn was bigger than most houses in town. The corrals were built from good timber instead of scrub wood, and even from this distance she could see cattle dotting the valley floor like dark seeds scattered across green cloth. "Jesus," she breathed, then immediately felt her cheeks burn. Ladies didn't take the Lord's name in vain, even ladies who'd just been sold on auction blocks. Jacob's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Language, Mrs. Crenshaw." It was the first thing he'd said since they'd left town, and hearing her name in his voice sent an odd shiver down her spine. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. She'd spent the entire ride trying to figure out what he wanted from her, what kind of work he expected, what kind of woman he thought he'd purchased. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Purchase. Legal or not, moral or not, $500 had bought him the right to her labor until Thomas's debts were paid. The wagon wheels crunched over gravel as they rolled down the long drive toward the main house. Up close, the place looked even more impressive and somehow more mysterious. The windows were clean but curtained. The porch was swept but empty of the usual chairs and trinkets that made a house look lived in. It was beautiful in the way a church was beautiful, perfect and cold and slightly forbidding. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop near the front steps and climbed down without a word. Martha remained frozen on the seat, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. This was it. This was her new life, whatever that meant. She was about to climb down and follow him inside when the front door opened and a woman stepped out onto the porch. Martha's heart stopped. The woman was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair pinned back severely and a face that was striking rather than pretty. She wore a simple brown dress that couldn't hide a figure that would make men stupid, and when her green eyes fell on Martha, they held a mixture of curiosity and something that looked dangerously like pity. "You didn't tell me she was coming today," the woman said to Jacob, her voice carrying a slight accent Martha couldn't place. Irish, maybe, or Scottish. "Wasn't planned," Jacob replied, reaching for Martha's carpetbag. "Sarah, this is Martha Crenshaw. She'll be staying with us for a while." Sarah? Of course there was a Sarah. Martha felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach as she finally climbed down from the wagon. She'd been so focused on figuring out Jacob's motives that she'd never considered he might already have a woman. What kind of arrangement was this? What kind of man bought another woman to bring home to his wife? "Mrs. Crenshaw," Sarah said, stepping forward with a smile that seemed genuine despite the awkwardness of the situation. "Welcome to Silent Ridge." "Thank you," Martha managed, though her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I'm sorry I didn't realize. Jacob didn't mention." "That I was here," Sarah laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Jacob doesn't mention much of anything. It's one of his more frustrating qualities." She shot him a look that held years of shared history. "Come inside. You must be exhausted." Martha followed Sarah into the house, acutely aware of Jacob's presence behind her like a shadow. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, polished wood floors, furniture that looked like it had been ordered from a catalog, oil paintings on the walls that depicted landscapes she'd never seen. But it was also oddly impersonal, like a hotel lobby designed to impress strangers rather than a home where people actually lived. "Tea," Sarah offered, leading them into a kitchen that was bigger than Martha's entire cabin had been. "Or something stronger. I imagine today's been trying." "Tea would be lovely," Martha said, sinking into a chair at the large wooden table. "Thank you." Jacob remained standing near the doorway, hat still on, looking like he was planning his escape. Sarah moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, setting the kettle to boil and arranging cups on a tray. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and unspoken tensions. "So," Sarah said finally, settling into the chair across from Martha, "Jacob tells me you're recently widowed. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Martha's throat tightened. It had been months since Thomas died, but talking about it still felt like swallowing glass. "It's been difficult." "I'm sure it has." Sarah's voice held genuine sympathy. "Losing someone you love is never easy, especially when you're left to face the world alone." There was something in the way she said it that made Martha look at her more closely. Sarah's hands rested on the table, and Martha noticed she wore no wedding ring. No ring at all, in fact. The cold weight in her stomach began to shift, reshaping itself into something even more confusing. "Are you?" Martha began, then stopped herself. It wasn't her place to ask personal questions, not when she was the intruder here. "Am I what?" Sarah prompted gently. "I just wondered. That is, I assumed you and Jacob were." "Married?" Sarah laughed again, but this time there was a bitter edge to it. "No, Mrs. Crenshaw, Jacob and I are not married." The kettle began to whistle, and Sarah rose to tend it, but not before Martha caught the look that passed between her and Jacob. It was complicated, painful, full of history that Martha could only guess at. She felt like she'd stepped into the middle of a play without knowing her lines or even what role she was supposed to be playing. "Sarah's my sister," Jacob said quietly from his position by the door. "Sister?" The word hit Martha like a physical blow, rearranging everything she'd assumed about the situation. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by embarrassment at her own assumptions, followed by a dozen new questions that she didn't dare ask. Half-sister technically, Sarah corrected, pouring hot water over tea leaves. Same father, different mothers, different lives until recently. Recently, Martha couldn't help herself. Sarah set the teapot down with more force than necessary. I arrived here 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and some very bad decisions chasing me from Denver. Jacob was kind enough to take me in, despite the fact that we'd never met before that day. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Martha felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. She knew what it felt like to have nowhere else to turn, to be dependent on the kindness of someone who owed you nothing. Maybe that's why Jacob had bid on her indenture, not out of some dark desire or mysterious agenda, but simple recognition of someone in the same position as his sister. "I see," Martha said softly. "Do you?" Sarah's green eyes were sharp now, studying Martha's face. "Because I'm not sure I do. Jacob's never brought home strays before, human or otherwise." "Sarah," Jacob's voice carried a warning. "What? She has a right to know what she's gotten herself into." Sarah poured tea into 3 cups, her movements precise and controlled. "Or what you've gotten her into, more accurately." Martha accepted the cup of tea with hands that trembled slightly. The liquid was hot and bitter, but she welcomed the burn against her throat. "What exactly have I gotten myself into, Mr. Reeves?" Jacob finally removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "I don't rightly know, Mrs. Crenshaw. I saw you up there on that platform, heard what they were offering, and He trailed off, staring into his own cup. "I couldn't let it happen." "Why?" The question came out sharper than Martha intended, but she was tired of dancing around the truth. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why would you spend $500 to help a stranger?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Martha began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because 7 years ago, I was the one standing on that platform." The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Martha felt her breath catch in her throat as the implication sank in. Jacob Reeves, the mysterious rancher who'd appeared in Millfield with enough money to buy the biggest spread in the county, had once been exactly where she was today, desperate, debt-ridden, and dependent on the mercy of strangers. "What happened?" she asked softly. Jacob's jaw tightened. "That's a story for another day." But Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that might have been mischief or might have been malice. "Oh, I think Mrs. Crenshaw deserves to know exactly what kind of man just bought her indenture, don't you, brother?" Jacob's face went white as bone, and for a moment Martha thought he might bolt from the kitchen entirely. The muscle in his jaw worked like he was chewing nails, and his hands gripped his teacup so tightly she could see his knuckles standing out like mountain peaks. Whatever Sarah was threatening to reveal, it cut deep enough to make the silent ridge rancher look like a man facing his own execution. "Sarah, don't." His voice was barely recognizable, rough with something that sounded dangerously close to panic. "Don't what? Tell her the truth." Sarah's smile was sharp as broken glass. "She's bound to you now, Jacob. Legally, morally, financially bound. Don't you think she has the right to know what she's tied herself to?" Martha felt like she was watching a snake circle a rabbit, and she wasn't sure which one was which. The tension between the siblings crackled across the kitchen table like lightning before a storm, full of old wounds and older secrets. Part of her wanted to know what had put that haunted look in Jacob's eyes, but another part, the part that had learned to read danger in a man's face during 8 years of marriage to Thomas, warned her that some secrets were better left buried. "Perhaps," Martha said carefully, "this isn't the time for—" "Oh, but it is exactly the time," Sarah interrupted, never taking her eyes off Jacob. You see, Mrs. Crenshaw, my dear brother here has something of a savior complex. He can't resist rescuing people, especially women in desperate situations. It's become quite the pattern." Jacob stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on wood. "I'm going to check on the cattle." "Sit down." Sarah's voice carried an authority that surprised Martha. Running away won't change what happened, and it won't protect her from the truth she needs to know. For a heartbeat, Martha thought Jacob would ignore his sister and storm out anyway. Instead, he slowly lowered himself back into the chair, but his entire body remained coiled like a spring under tension. When he looked at Martha, his dark eyes held something she'd never seen there before, shame so deep it made her chest ache. "7 years ago," Sarah began, her voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller settling into a well-worn tale, "my brother was married to a woman named Elizabeth Kane. Beautiful girl, sweet as honey, the kind of woman who made men forget their own names just by walking past. They had a little spread down in Texas, nothing fancy but enough to get by. Jacob was working himself half to death trying to make it profitable, and Elizabeth was playing the perfect rancher's wife." Martha glanced at Jacob and saw his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his fingertips were white. A muscle ticked in his cheek like a trapped insect. "The drought hit their second year," Sarah continued, seemingly oblivious to her brother's distress. "Cattle died, crops failed, debts piled up faster than snow in a blizzard. Sound familiar, Mrs. Crenshaw?" It did, sickeningly familiar. Martha felt her own memories stirring, the worry lines around Thomas's eyes, the way he'd started drinking more and sleeping less, the stack of unpaid bills that grew taller each week like a paper monument to their failures. "Jacob mortgaged everything," Sarah said. "The land, the cattle, even Elizabeth's wedding ring. When that wasn't enough, he borrowed from some very unpleasant men with very specific ideas about collateral and collection." Martha's tea had gone cold in her hands, but she didn't dare move to set it down. She could feel the story building toward something terrible, like watching storm clouds gather on a clear day. When the loans came due and they couldn't pay, those unpleasant men showed up at their door with an offer. Sarah's green eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. They'd forgive the debt in exchange for Elizabeth. Not permanently, they said, just until she worked off what was owed. A year, maybe 2 at most. The bottom dropped out of Martha's stomach. She knew, even before Sarah spoke the words, how this story ended. She could see it in the devastation written across Jacob's features, in the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to protect something that was already lost. Jacob refused, of course, said he'd find another way, sell everything they had, work double shifts at the railroad if he had to. But Elizabeth, Sarah paused, savoring the moment like wine. Elizabeth had other ideas. "Stop," Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. She went to them that night while Jacob was in town trying to arrange another loan, made the deal herself, said she wouldn't watch her husband destroy himself over debt when she could solve the problem with a year of her life. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspirative whisper. She left him a note saying she loved him too much to let him sacrifice everything for her pride. Martha felt tears sting her eyes. She could picture it so clearly, a desperate woman making an impossible choice to save the man she loved, not understanding that some sacrifices destroy the very thing they're meant to protect. It was exactly the kind of noble, stupid, heartbreaking decision that love made people capable of. Jacob went after her, of course, Sarah continued. Tracked her to a brothel in El Paso where those unpleasant men had put her to work. By the time he found her, she'd been there 6 months. She was. Sarah glanced at Jacob's face and for the first time seemed to register the damage her words were doing. She wasn't the same woman who'd left that note. Jacob made a sound like a wounded animal, raw and broken, and full of pain that had been festering for 7 years. Martha wanted to reach for him, to offer some kind of comfort, but she was frozen by the horror of what she was hearing. "What happened to her?" Martha asked, though she dreaded the answer. Laudanum, Jacob said quietly, speaking for the first time since Sarah had begun her story. She'd started taking it for the pain, then couldn't stop. By the time I found her, she was taking enough to kill a horse just to get through each day. Jacob bought her back, Sarah said, her voice gentler now. Spent every penny he had and borrowed more besides. Brought her home, got her clean, nursed her back to health. For a while it seemed like everything might be all right. But of course it wasn't all right. Martha could see that in the way Jacob's shoulders shook, in the careful way Sarah chose her next words. She couldn't forgive herself, Jacob whispered. Or me. Every time she looked at me, all she could see was what she'd sacrificed, what she'd become. I tried to tell her it didn't matter, that I loved her no matter what, but, he shrugged helplessly. Love isn't always enough to heal that kind of damage. She took her own life, Sarah said simply. Left another note, this one saying she couldn't live with what those men had turned her into. Said Jacob deserved better than a broken woman. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha felt like she'd been hit by a runaway horse, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd just learned. Jacob Reeves wasn't just a mysterious rancher who'd appeared with money and secrets. He was a man who'd lost everything to debt and desperation, who'd watched the woman he loved destroy herself trying to save him, who'd been living with that guilt for 7 years. And now he'd brought home another desperate woman, another widow facing indenture and humiliation. The pattern Sarah had mentioned suddenly made terrible sense. That's why you bid on me, Martha said, her voice barely audible. Not to help me, but to try to save her again. Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with something that might have been anger or desperation or both. No, that's not. I didn't. Didn't you? Sarah asked softly. Another desperate woman, another chance to be the hero you couldn't be for Elizabeth. Tell me I'm wrong, Jacob. Jacob surged to his feet again, this time making it halfway to the door before Martha's voice stopped him cold. Were there others? He froze, his back to them, shoulders rigid with tension. Were there other women you tried to save? Martha pressed, standing slowly. Other widows, other desperate souls you brought home thinking you could fix what happened to Elizabeth. The silence stretched like a taut wire. When Jacob finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Martha had to strain to hear him. 3. The number hit her like a physical blow. 3 other women had stood where she was standing, had felt the weight of his guilt and good intentions, had become unwilling players in his attempt to rewrite history. What happened to them? Martha asked, though she was terrified of the answer. They left. Jacob turned around slowly, and the devastation in his face made Martha's heart clench. One after 6 months, one after a year, one after just 3 weeks. They all left, and they were right to leave. Because Sarah's right, I wasn't trying to save them. I was trying to save her, and you can't save someone who's already dead. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha felt the weight of it settling over her, the understanding that she was just the latest in a line of women who'd become unwilling participants in Jacob Reeves' 7-year-old tragedy. But as she looked at his broken face, at the man who'd spent $500 and opened his home to a stranger because he couldn't stop trying to atone for sins that weren't his to carry, Martha felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not anger, though she had every right to that. Not fear, though the smart thing would be to demand he take her back to town immediately. Pity, deep, aching pity for a man so destroyed by loss that he'd spent 7 years trying to resurrect a ghost. Martha set her teacup down with deliberate care, the small clink against the saucer unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. She could feel both siblings watching her, waiting for her reaction, and for a moment she understood exactly how a butterfly must feel pinned to a display board. The smart thing would be to demand Jacob take her back to town immediately, debt or no debt. The safe thing would be to run from this house of ghosts and good intentions before she became another casualty in Jacob's war against his own guilt. Instead, she surprised herself by laughing. It wasn't a pleasant sound, too sharp, too brittle, edged with hysteria that she couldn't quite suppress. But it was real, and it seemed to startle both Reeves' siblings out of their dramatic standoff. "I'm sorry," Martha gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth as another laugh escaped. "It's just, here I was thinking you were some kind of predator, planning to take advantage of my situation, and instead you're just—" She gestured helplessly at Jacob's stricken face. "You're just a man trying to apologize to a dead woman by rescuing every widow who crosses your path." Jacob flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Mrs. Crenshaw, No." Martha held up a hand, suddenly exhausted by the whole ridiculous situation. "Let me finish. Do you want to know what I was thinking during that wagon ride? I was wondering if you expected me to warm your bed as part of my indenture. I was planning how I'd kill myself before I'd let another man use me like Thomas did." The words fell into silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock across both faces. Martha hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about this house of secrets seemed to demand honesty, no matter how painful. "Your husband hurt you," Sarah said softly. "It wasn't a question." Martha's laugh this time was bitter as winter wind. "Thomas was a good man when he was sober and the farm was doing well, but when the drinking got bad—" She touched her ribs unconsciously, remembering the ache of old bruises. "Let's just say I understand why Elizabeth couldn't forgive herself. Sometimes the things that happen to us change who we are in ways that can't be undone." Jacob's face had gone ashen. "I didn't know, I never thought." "Of course you didn't." Martha felt an odd sort of relief at having the truth in the open. "You were so busy seeing Elizabeth in every desperate woman that you forgot we might have our own demons to wrestle with. I'm not your dead wife, Mr. Reeves. I'm not some innocent maiden who needs rescuing from the big bad world. I'm a woman who's survived 8 years of marriage to a man who thought his fists were God's answer to his failures." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Martha with new interest. "And yet you stayed with him." "Where was I supposed to go?" Martha shot back. "Back to my father, who sold me to Thomas in the first place to settle his gambling debts. To my sister, who made it clear I wasn't welcome after I married beneath my station. I stayed because staying was surviving, and surviving was all I knew how to do." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and completely unplanned. Martha felt stripped bare, but also oddly liberated. For 8 years she'd kept Thomas's violence a secret, covering bruises with powder and explaining away her flinches as clumsiness. Now, sitting in this kitchen full of strangers and ghosts, she'd finally spoken the truth aloud. "Jesus," Jacob breathed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm sorry, I'm so damn sorry." "For what?" "For not being a mind reader." Martha shook her head. "You want to know something funny? When I saw you bid on my indenture, part of me was grateful. Not because I thought you were Prince Charming come to save me, but because at least you weren't Pete Whitman with his filthy grin and his worn-out boots." "That's a hell of a low bar," Sarah observed dryly. "You'd be surprised how low the bar gets when you're standing on an auction block watching your neighbors bid on your desperation like it's Saturday entertainment." Martha felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and surprisingly energizing. "Do you know what the worst part was? Not the humiliation, not even the fear. It was the laughter. My own neighbors, people whose children I'd taught, whose sick I'd nursed, standing there laughing like my misery was the finest joke they'd heard all year." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. "If I'd known what they were planning." "You'd have what? Ridden into town like some knight-errant and saved me from my fate." Martha's voice sharpened. "I don't need saving, Mr. Reeves. I need a place to work off my dead husband's debts and a chance to start over somewhere that doesn't know my story. If you can provide that without trying to turn me into your personal redemption project, then we might just survive each other." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of a clock somewhere in the depths of the house. Jacob stared at Martha like he was seeing her for the first time, which maybe he was. Sarah watched them both with the expression of someone witnessing a fascinating experiment that might explode at any moment. "I can do that," Jacob said finally. "Provide work, I mean, and a place to stay until your debt's cleared. But I won't lie to you, I don't know how to do this without," he gestured helplessly, "without trying to fix things." "Then learn." Martha's voice was gentler now, but no less firm. "Because I'm not broken, Mr. Reeves. Damaged, maybe. Scarred, certainly. But not broken. And I don't need you to put me back together because I was never falling apart in the first place." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, like clouds parting to let through unexpected sunlight. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked at her without the weight of his ghosts clouding his vision. "What kind of work?" Martha asked, sensing an opportunity to move the conversation onto safer ground. "What do you need from an indentured servant with no ranching experience and a tendency toward brutal honesty?" Jacob's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Sarah handles the house and the books. I manage the cattle and the land, but we've been needing someone to help with the horses, breaking them, training them, getting them ready for sale. It's delicate work that requires patience and a gentle hand." "I've never worked with horses." "But you've worked with difficult creatures who need careful handling," Sarah interjected, giving Martha a meaningful look. "Sounds like you're well qualified." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't deny the implication. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing." Jacob stood, seeming to shake off the last of his earlier devastation. "There's a Mustang we caught last week that's been giving us trouble. Too wild to break with force, too valuable to give up on. Maybe a different approach is what's needed." "And where will I sleep?" Martha asked, suddenly aware that she still didn't know the practical details of her new life. "There's a room upstairs," Sarah said, rising from the table. "Small but private with a good view of the valley. It was mine when I first arrived, before Jacob built me my own cabin. You'll have your own space, your own key, your own life. No one will bother you there unless you want to be bothered." The promise of privacy, of a space that belonged to her alone, made Martha's throat tight with unexpected emotion. She'd shared a bed with Thomas for 8 years, never knowing when he'd come home drunk and angry, never having a moment that was truly her own. The idea of a room with a lock, a place where she could exist without fear or performance, was more precious than gold. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah warned, but her smile took the sting out of the words. "Wait until you've spent a week dealing with my brother's morning moods and his tendency to brood over coffee like it holds the secrets of the universe." "I heard that," Jacob called from the doorway, and Martha was startled to realize his voice held something that sounded almost like humor. "You were meant to." Sarah began clearing the tea things with brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Crenshaw, would you like to see your room? I imagine you'd like to settle in before dinner." Martha nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The day had started with her standing on an auction block being offered for a pair of boots, and had somehow ended with her agreeing to train wild horses for a man haunted by his dead wife's ghost. It felt like a year's worth of living crammed into a single afternoon. As she followed Sarah toward the stairs, Martha caught Jacob watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the guilty desperation from earlier, but something more complex. Respect, maybe, or surprise, as if she'd said something that had shifted his understanding of the world in a way he hadn't expected. "Mrs. Crenshaw," he called as she reached the doorway. "Yes." "For what it's worth, I'm glad it was me who bid on your indenture. Not because I think you needed saving, but because I think maybe," he paused, searching for the right words, "maybe we can help each other figure out how to live with the ghosts we carry." Martha considered this for a long moment. "Maybe we can," she agreed. "But I won't be your Elizabeth, Mr. Reeves. I won't be anyone but myself." "I wouldn't ask you to be." As Martha climbed the stairs behind Sarah, she found herself believing him. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because someone else had decided her fate, but because she'd chosen to stay and see what tomorrow might bring. Behind them, Jacob remained in the kitchen, staring out the window at the mountains that surrounded his valley like protective walls. For 7 years, he'd seen every woman who crossed his threshold through the lens of his guilt and grief. But Martha Crenshaw had just reminded him that other people had their own stories, their own ghosts, their own ways of surviving in a world that seemed determined to break them. Maybe that was exactly what they all needed, not salvation, but recognition. Not rescue, but respect. Not a chance to rewrite the past, but an opportunity to write something entirely new. Martha woke before dawn to the sound of horses calling to each other across the valley, their voices carrying the wild loneliness of creatures who remembered what freedom felt like. She'd slept better than she had in months, wrapped in clean sheets that smelled of lavender instead of whiskey and regret, behind a door that locked from the inside and kept the world at bay. For a moment she lay still, listening to the sounds of a ranch coming alive around her, and marveled at how different morning felt when you weren't dreading what the day might bring. By the time she made her way downstairs, Sarah already had coffee brewing and eggs crackling in the pan. Jacob was nowhere to be seen, but his muddy boots by the door and the lingering scent of horse and leather suggested he'd been up and working for hours already. "Morning," Sarah said without turning around. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in years," Martha admitted, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered. "Where's Jacob?" "Down at the corrals, wrestling with that Mustang I mentioned. He's been out there since before sunrise, probably trying to prove he doesn't need help breaking a horse that's already broken 2 good ropes and given Billy Hendricks a concussion." Martha raised an eyebrow. Billy Hendricks. One of the ranch hands, young, enthusiastic, and dumb as a post when it comes to reading an animal's mood. Sarah cracked another egg into the pan with more force than necessary. "Jacob sent him home yesterday after the Mustang nearly took his head off. Now he's out there trying to do the job himself because he can't stand the idea of admitting some horses can't be broken by sheer stubbornness." Through the kitchen window, Martha could see a dust cloud rising from the direction of the corrals, accompanied by what sounded like creative cursing. She set down her coffee cup and headed toward the door. "Where are you going?" Sarah called. "To work," Martha replied simply. The scene that greeted her at the corrals was both spectacular and terrifying. A black Mustang stallion, beautiful as sin and twice as dangerous, was doing his level best to kill the man who dared try to put a rope on him. Jacob stood in the center of the corral, covered in dust and sweat, holding a lariat that had seen better days. His movements were confident but tense, and Martha could see the frustration radiating from every line of his body. The Mustang was magnificent, probably 16 hands high, with a coat like polished coal and eyes that held the fire of untamed country. He moved like liquid lightning, all power and grace and absolute refusal to submit. When he reared up on his hind legs, striking at the air with hooves that could crush a man's skull, Martha's breath caught in her throat at the raw beauty of it. Jacob tried to throw the rope again, and the Mustang spun away with contemptuous ease, kicking up a cloud of dust that sent Jacob into a coughing fit. That's when Martha noticed the blood on his shirt, the way he favored his left side, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of exhaustion pushed too far. "You're going to get yourself killed," she called out, climbing up on the corral fence. Jacob looked up, startled by her voice. "I can handle him." "I'm sure you can. The question is whether you should." Martha studied the Mustang, who had retreated to the far side of the corral and was watching them both with intelligent, wary eyes. "How long have you been at this?" "Couple hours." "Jacob." Martha's voice carried the same tone she'd used with her students when they lied about finishing their homework. "How long?" He had the grace to look sheepish. "Since about 4 this morning." "So you're tired, frustrated, and bleeding, trying to break a horse that's tired, frustrated, and angry. I'm not an expert, but that seems like a recipe for someone getting badly hurt. Jacob wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt behind. He's too valuable to give up on. Good bloodlines, perfect confirmation. If we can break him, he'll bring top dollar at the horse market in Denver. And if he kills you in the process? He won't kill me. Martha looked at the Mustang again, noting the way his ears flicked forward when she spoke, the curious tilt of his head despite his defensive posture. What's his story? Caught him running with a wild herd up in the high country. He's probably never seen a rope before last week, never had a human hand on him. Jacob moved closer to the fence, giving the horse more space. Most Mustangs that age, they've got some contact with people, some understanding of what we want from them. But this one is purely wild, Martha finished. No wonder he's fighting so hard. You're not just trying to break him to saddle, you're trying to break everything he is. Something in her tone made Jacob pause. He looked at her more closely, noting the way she watched the Mustang with something that looked like recognition. You see something I don't. Martha climbed down from the fence and entered the corral, moving slowly and deliberately. The Mustang's attention fixed on her immediately, ears pricked forward, body coiled but not quite ready to flee. She stopped about 10 feet away and simply stood there, making no move toward him, offering no threat. "What are you doing?" Jacob asked quietly. "Introducing myself." Martha kept her voice low and calm. "You've been trying to dominate him, to make him submit through force and persistence. But look at him, Jacob. Really look at him." Jacob studied the Mustang more carefully, and slowly his expression began to change. The horse was magnificent, yes, but there was something else there, a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. His eyes held the hollow look of a creature that had been pushed beyond its limits, that was fighting now not from strength but from sheer desperate refusal to surrender. "He's not angry," Martha said softly. "He's terrified. Everything he's ever known has been taken away from him, his herd, his territory, his freedom. And now you're asking him to give up the last thing he has left, his identity as a wild creature." The Mustang took a hesitant step toward Martha, then stopped, confusion warring with curiosity in his dark eyes. She remained perfectly still, letting him make the choice to approach or retreat. "How do you know all this?" Jacob asked. Martha's smile was sad and knowing. "Because I recognize the look. I've seen it in my own mirror often enough." For several minutes, they stood in silence while the Mustang worked through his internal struggle. Slowly, carefully, he moved closer to Martha until he was near enough to catch her scent. His nostrils flared as he processed this new information, female, calm, unafraid but respectful. When Martha finally moved, it was just to extend her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. The Mustang snorted and backed up a step, but didn't bolt. After another long moment, he stretched his neck forward until his velvet nose just barely touched her palm. "Hello, beautiful," Martha whispered. "I know exactly how you feel." Jacob watched in amazement as the horse that had been trying to kill him for hours began to relax under Martha's patient attention. She didn't try to touch him beyond that first contact, didn't attempt to put a rope on him or assert any kind of dominance. She simply stood there, offering calm acceptance of what he was rather than demanding he become something else. "This is impossible," Jacob breathed. "He nearly took my head off 20 minutes ago." "Because you were trying to take his soul," Martha replied, never taking her eyes off the Mustang. "Some things can't be broken, Jacob. They can only be invited to change." The Mustang lowered his head until his forehead was nearly touching Martha's shoulder. Not submission, exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition of a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to survive by refusing to surrender the essential self. "What now?" Jacob asked. "Now we give him time to decide who he wants to become. Breaking him to saddle isn't the goal, teaching him that he can trust us is. Once he believes we won't try to destroy what makes him who he is, he might choose to work with us instead of against us." Martha slowly backed away from the Mustang, who watched her go with what looked like disappointment. But he didn't follow, and he didn't retreat to the far corner of the corral. Instead, he stood in the center of the space, no longer the desperate, dangerous creature Jacob had been fighting, but not yet the willing partner he might become. "You realize this could take weeks," Jacob said as they climbed out of the corral. "Good things usually do." Martha dusted off her hands and looked back at the Mustang, who was now watching them with calm curiosity instead of fear and rage. "Besides, I'm not going anywhere. I've got a debt to work off, remember." Jacob's expression grew serious. "About that, I've been thinking, and maybe we should discuss terms. How long you'll need to stay, what kind of work arrangement." "No," Martha's voice was firm. "We had a deal, Mr. Reeves. $500 worth of work, fair and square. I won't be another charity case you can feel guilty about later." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Martha studied his face carefully. "You're already starting to worry that you've taken advantage of me, that somehow you've become the villain in this story. But you're not, and I'm not a victim. I'm a woman who made a choice to accept your offer because it was better than the alternatives." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "And if better opportunities come along, if someone offers you a way out that doesn't involve working off a debt you never should have had to pay?" Martha considered this, watching the Mustang pace the perimeter of the corral with nervous energy. "Then I'll make that choice when it comes. But for now, this is where I choose to be. Working with horses that need patience instead of force, living in a house where I don't have to be afraid of what mood the man might be in when he comes home drunk." The comparison hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. Jacob's face darkened with anger, not at her, but at the dead man who had made her so grateful for basic safety that she considered it a luxury. "Thomas was a fool," he said quietly. "Thomas was a broken man who broke other people because he didn't know how to fix himself." Martha's voice held no bitterness, just weary acceptance. "But he's dead, and I'm alive, and that Mustang in there needs someone who understands that survival sometimes means fighting everything and everyone until you find someone worth trusting." As if summoned by her words, the Mustang appeared at the fence, studying them both with intelligent eyes. When he saw Martha looking at him, he nickered softly, not a challenge or a demand, but something that sounded almost like a greeting. "I think he likes you," Jacob observed. "I think he recognizes me," Martha corrected. "It takes one survivor to know another." Behind them, Sarah's voice called from the house, announcing that breakfast was ready. But neither Martha nor Jacob moved immediately. They stood watching the Mustang, who had settled into a more relaxed posture, and in the growing light of morning, all three of them seemed to be considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there were kinds of freedom that didn't require running away. 3 months later, Martha stood in the same corral where she'd first met the black Mustang, watching him respond to her gentle guidance with a grace that still took her breath away. Storm, as she'd named him, wore a halter now, but no saddle, no bit, no harsh constraints. He moved at her request rather than her command, turning left or right with subtle shifts of her body language, stopping when she exhaled, coming to her when she simply stood still and waited. The transformation had been gradual, built on small moments of trust rather than dramatic breakthroughs. A week of simply sharing space with him. Another week of gentle touches that asked permission rather than demanded submission. Slowly, carefully, Storm had learned that Martha's presence meant safety rather than threat, partnership rather than domination. And somewhere in the process of teaching him to trust, Martha had learned something about trust herself. "He's ready," she told Jacob, who was leaning against the fence watching their morning session. "Not for a saddle yet, but for the next step. He'll let you touch him now, as long as you approach him the way I've shown you." Jacob nodded, though she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Over the past 3 months, he'd watched Martha work magic with not just Storm but 3 other horses that had been deemed too difficult or dangerous to bother with. Her methods were unlike anything he'd ever seen: patient where others were forceful, intuitive where others relied on established technique. She read horses the way some people read books, understanding their fears and motivations with an almost supernatural clarity. But it was more than her skill with the animals that had changed things at Silent Ridge. Martha herself had bloomed in ways that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone else. The fearful, desperate woman who'd stood on that auction block had gradually given way to someone confident and capable, someone who laughed at Sarah's sharp wit and challenged Jacob's assumptions, and filled the ranch house with a warmth it had been missing for 7 years. "There's something I need to tell you," Jacob said as Martha led Storm to the water trough. "I got word from town yesterday. Pete Whitman's been asking around about you." Martha's hand stilled on Storm's neck, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of asking?" "The kind that suggests he's not done thinking about those boots." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Seems he's been telling folks that your indenture was illegal, that a debt holder can't just transfer obligations to someone else without proper legal proceedings." "And is he right?" Jacob shrugged. "Law's murky on the subject. Could go either way, depending on which judge hears it and how much Pete's willing to spend on lawyers." Martha was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Storm's neck while she processed this news. The horse sensed her tension and moved closer, offering his solid presence as comfort. "What does that mean for us?" she asked finally. "Could mean he'll challenge the arrangement, try to force you back to town to honor the original indenture." Jacob paused, choosing his words carefully. "Or it could mean he's just trying to stir up trouble because he can't stand the idea that you escaped his little joke." "And what do you think?" "I think Pete Whitman is the kind of man who can't bear to lose, especially to someone he considers beneath him." Jacob's voice carried a hard edge Martha had rarely heard before. "I also think he's underestimated what he's dealing with." Martha turned to face him fully, noting the protective stance, the way his hands had unconsciously curled into fists. "Jacob, I don't need you to fight my battles for me. I know that, but I won't stand by and watch someone try to drag you back to that auction block either." The fierce certainty in his voice sent warmth spreading through Martha's chest. Over the past 3 months, she'd watched Jacob slowly shed the haunted desperation that had defined him when they first met. He still carried his grief, probably always would, but it no longer consumed him. He'd learned to see her as herself rather than as a proxy for his dead wife, and in doing so, he'd begun to heal wounds that had festered for 7 years. "There's something else," Martha said quietly. "Something I need to tell you before Pete Whitman or anyone else forces the issue." Jacob's expression grew wary. "What is it?" Martha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of words she'd been carrying for weeks. "My debt to you was paid off a month ago." The statement hit Jacob like a physical blow. She could see him doing the calculations, remembering the work she'd done, the horses she'd trained, the value she'd added to his operation. A month ago. She'd been free to leave for a month and she'd said nothing. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the hurt underneath. "Because I was afraid," Martha admitted. "Afraid that if you knew I could leave, you'd start treating me like a guest instead of a partner. Afraid that the easy friendship we'd built would turn into something awkward and formal. Afraid that you'd feel obligated to send me away because staying wouldn't be proper. And now Pete Whitman is stirring up trouble, and you have a right to know where things stand before you decide whether you want to get involved in a legal fight over a woman who isn't even legally bound to you anymore." Jacob leaned against the fence post, his face unreadable. "So what happens now? Do you want to leave?" "Do you want me to?" "That's not an answer." Martha felt Storm nudge her shoulder gently, as if reminding her that sometimes the bravest thing was simply telling the truth. "No," she said quietly. "I don't want to leave. I like it here. I like the work, I like Sarah's sharp tongue and your quiet steadiness, and the way this place feels like home instead of just somewhere to survive. But I won't stay if you only offered me a place because you felt guilty about my situation. And if I offered you a place because I've come to care about you. Not as Elizabeth's replacement, not as some charity case, but as Martha Crenshaw, the woman who taught me that some things can't be broken, only invited to change. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious, and terrifying in their honesty. Martha felt her heart skip as she recognized the shift in Jacob's voice, the way he was looking at her like she was something rare and valuable rather than just useful. I'd say that depends on what kind of place you're offering, she replied, surprised by her own boldness. Jacob straightened, seeming to gather his courage. The kind where you'd have a say in how things are run, where your name would be on the deed alongside mine, where you'd be my partner in every sense of the word if you'd have me. Martha's breath caught. Jacob. I know it's complicated. I know my past makes it complicated, and your past makes it complicated, and half the town will have opinions about the propriety of it all. But I also know that I wake up every morning grateful that Pete Whitman made his cruel joke, because it brought you here. I know that watching you work with these horses has taught me more about patience and healing than 7 years of guilt and regret ever could. And I know that when I think about my future, I can't picture it without you in it. Tears stung Martha's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. For so long, she'd believed that her capacity for happiness had been beaten out of her by Thomas's fists and the world's casual cruelty. But standing here in the morning sunlight, with Storm's warm presence at her side and Jacob's heart laid bare before her, she felt something she'd thought was lost forever stirring to life in her chest. "What about Sarah?" she asked, because practical concerns had a way of asserting themselves even in moments of perfect possibility. "Sarah's been planning to move to San Francisco since the day she arrived here," Jacob said with a slight smile. "She's got friends there, business opportunities. She's only stayed this long to make sure I didn't do anything too stupid in my quest to save every damaged soul west of the Mississippi. And now she thinks I've finally found someone worth saving myself for." The simplicity of it took Martha's breath away. Not salvation in the sense of being rescued from her circumstances, but salvation in the deeper sense of finding someone who made her want to be the best version of herself. Someone who saw her scars and called them beautiful, who honored her strength instead of trying to protect her from her own choices. "I have conditions," she said, because even in fairy tales, smart women negotiated terms. "Name them." "No more trying to save broken women. No more bringing home strays because you think they need rescuing. If we're going to build something together, it has to be about us, not about your guilt over Elizabeth." Jacob nodded solemnly. "Agreed, what else?" "The horses stay mine to train. I won't have you undoing months of patient work because you think you know better." "Fair enough. And if Pete Whitman or anyone else wants to challenge our arrangement, we face it together. No more keeping secrets to protect each other's feelings." "Together," Jacob agreed, "always together." Martha looked around the ranch that had become her home, at the horses that had taught her about trust, at the man who'd learned to see her as herself rather than a ghost. In the distance, she could see Sarah watching from the kitchen window, probably already planning her escape to California with the satisfaction of a matchmaker whose work was finally done. "All right then," Martha said, extending her hand to Jacob with mock formality. "Partners." Instead of shaking her hand, Jacob took it gently and raised it to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth racing up her arm. "Partners," he agreed, "in everything." Behind them, Storm whinnied softly, as if adding his own approval to the arrangement. And as Martha looked into Jacob's eyes and saw her own future reflected there, not perfect, but real and chosen and full of possibility, she thought about the laughter that had followed Pete Whitman's cruel joke 3 months ago. Let them laugh now, she thought. Let them try to understand how a woman offered for a pair of boots had found something worth more than all the gold in Colorado. Let them wonder how a silent rancher and a desperate widow had learned to speak the language of healing. Some stories, Martha realized, were too beautiful for small minds to comprehend. And this story, their story, was just beginning.